It turns its attention at first to its purity, that is, its abstract form. But since reason qua observer apprehends the object which moves among its own distinct moments as an inert being, its laws of thought become connections of one constant moment to another constant moment. But the content of these laws being only moments, these run together into the single unit of self-consciousness. This new object, similarly taken as an inert being, is the single contingent self-consciousness. Observation stands, therefore, within what it imagines to be spirit, and within the contingent relation of conscious reality to a reality that is not conscious. Spirit alone is in its own self the necessity of this relation. Observation, therefore, looks more closely at this object and compares its reality, which wills and acts, with its reality, which ponders and is reflected into itself, a reality which is itself objective. This outer aspect, although a language of the individual which he possesses within himself, is at the same time, qua sign, something indifferent to the content it is supposed to denote, just as that which posits for itself the sign is indifferent to it. Here in paragraph 242, Hegel is sketching out for us what it is that observing reason has been observing and where it is going. He's also in the paragraph that's going to follow this still engaged in the critique of phrenology, giving it its own place and showing where it's falling apart. And so this is sort of lead up into that. He starts out by talking about the laws of thought and then moves to single contingent self-consciousness, then talks about the relationship between different aspects, you might say, or sides of conscious reality, self-consciousness, and then he ends up talking about the sign. And you remember, for Hegel, sign, Zeichen, is always going to be arbitrary. He's not a semiologist in the sense that, later people who are coming along are, where they see that signs are motivated or they reveal more to us or anything like that. When Hegel talks about a sign, he really does think that the relationship between signifier and signified, or sign and referent, or whatever you want to call it, is highly contingent. It's conventional. It can be whatever you want it to be. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Now, let's take up the text itself. He says, it turns its attention, what's it? It's reason, who is now trying to make sense of things, right? And he's going to sketch out for us how it's getting things wrong at first. So he says, it turns its attention first to its purity, that is, its abstract form. But since reason, qua observer, apprehends the object, which moves among its own distinct moments as an inert being, its laws of thought, remember back in the section previous to this one, reason was attempting to produce laws of thought, logical and psychological laws that would apply to human beings across the board. We saw that there were some problems with that. Hegel's not interested in those problems essentially of freedom and agency at this point, and interpretation. He's interested in something different. He says, well, those laws of thought are just connecting together a bunch of moments. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, the human life and the thoughts that we have, they are occurring, through time, right? And so what unifies those? What connects them together? We can say, well, laws of thought do, but for who? For what? This is where we have a transition to self-consciousness. And he talks about a single, contingent self-consciousness. Or we might just as well talk about a whole bevy of single contingent self-consciousnesses, because this could be any person. This could be any self-consciousness. This could be whatever it is, whoever it is, rather, that we want it to be. So he goes on and he says, these laws of thought become connections of one constant moment to another constant moment. But the content of these laws being only moments, these run together into the single unit of self-consciousness. This new object, so this is an advance. This observing reason has found something new for itself in the process. This new object, similarly taken as an inert being, is the single contingent self-consciousness. That was a problem, right? The single contingent self-consciousness was counterposed to the laws of thought, and that's why in the transition from the previous section to this section, we said, okay, I get it. The single contingent self-consciousness, that matters. Let's look at him or her or it or whatever. Of course, when we do that, we're also saying, let me look at me or you. If we're doing phenomenology, right? Because I'm a single contingent self-consciousness, so are you. So is Hegel. Maybe world historically, perhaps not, right? But you get the idea. So he goes on and he says, observation stands within what it imagines to be spirit. Notice that it's imagining it to be spirit. It's not, Hegel's not saying this actually is what spirit is. Observation is getting this somewhat wrong. He says, within the contingent relation of the conscious reality to a reality that is not conscious. So self-consciousness involves a relationship between consciousness, conscious reality, which is it, right? And a reality that is not conscious. It's other. The other of perception, the other of force in the understanding, the other of the other person being treated merely as an object, for example, in the master-slave dialectic. The reversal of that happened in the unhappy consciousness, where one made oneself, this is talked about in the next paragraph, into something that's supposed to be not conscious, that's just in itself, and then it gets displaced. The agency, the spirituality gets displaced to this beyond, which is really oneself. So this conscious reality, what happens when observation looks at it more closely? Well, it splits up into two parts. Here's something really interesting happens. Hegel says, observation looks more closely at this object and compares its reality which wills, wollende, right, and acts, tun, right? That's the verb there, to do, to act, right? It compares that against the other part, which is pondering, which is reflected. Reflected into itself. He compares the reality which wills and acts with its reality which ponders and is reflected into itself. A reality, as Hegel says, which is itself objective. So this seems to be where we've got the reflexivity of self-consciousness, right? Because what is it pondering or reflecting on? Well, what it does. Now notice what Hegel does at this point, though. We would be tempted to say, okay, well that's the inner, that's the outer, this is where spirit is probably going to be. Remember, Hegel has consistently told us over and over and over again, where's spirit? Where's reality? Where's the individual? It's in what you do. There's a affirmation of the practical here. You are what you choose and what you do, even more than what you happen to think. Or, in this case, why is he talking about signs here? Because this is what you say about yourself. The pondering is the you talking about what your actions mean, what your choices mean. So he goes on and he says, this outer aspect, although a language of the individual which he possesses within himself. So it's outer and it's inner. This outer aspect of a language of the individual he possesses within himself is at the same time qua sign. Qua sign, something indifferent to the content it is supposed to denote. What is the content? This stuff over here, what the person is willing. Isn't that interesting? This is a classic Hegelian reversal here. It's indifferent to the content it's supposed to denote, just as that which posits for itself, the sign is indifferent to it. So what we've got here is a progression of reason that is, you might say, slowly losing sight of its object. This is going to happen even more in the paragraph to come. For this reason, observation finally goes back again from this inconstant language to the fixed being, and declares in accordance with its notion that externality is the outer and immediate reality of spirit, not as an organ and not as a language or a sign, but as a dead thing. What was ruled out by the very first observation of inorganic nature, that is, the idea that the notion ought to be present in the form of a thing, is reinstated by this last form of observation in such a way that it turns the reality of spirit itself into a thing, or expressing it the other way round, gives to lifeless being the significance of spirit. Observation has here reached the point where it openly declares what our notion of it was, that is, that the certainty of reason seeks its own self as an objective reality. Of course, the intention here is not to state that spirit, which is represented by a skull, is a thing. There is not meant to be any materialism, as it is called in this idea. Rather, spirit must be something more and other than these bones. But to say that spirit merely is means nothing else that it is a thing. When being as such or thinghood is predicated of spirit, the true expression of this is that spirit is therefore the same kind of being that a bone is. It must therefore be regarded as extremely important that the true expression has been found for the bare statement about spirit, that it is. When in other respects it is said of spirit that it is, that it has being, is a thing, a single separate reality, this is not intended to mean that it is something we can see or take in our hands or touch and so on, but that is what is said. And what really is said is expressed by saying that the being of spirit is a bone. We come now in paragraph 343 to Hegel's very famous statement that spirit is a bone. It's where he actually says it as such. We've mentioned that a little bit earlier in paragraphs leading up to this, but here is where he has that lapidary saying, which has misled so many people. Hegel is not saying spirit is a bone. He is not advocating that. He is not celebrating that as a great insight. He is saying that is one of the fundamental ways in which observing reason or observation goes astray. This is a cul-de-sac that if we stay in, we will never get out of. This is not an advance. It's only an advance if we realize how wrong it is and we move past it. And so in this paragraph, he's really driving home to us how mistaken this point of view is, even when it tries to build into itself a certain kind of sophistication. So he starts out by talking about observation or observing reason, getting away from the inconstant language that we ended the last paragraph with, and wanting to shift to talking in terms of a fixed being. So what is that fixed being? He says that it declares in accordance with its notion that externality is the outer and immediate reality of spirit. Not as an organ, not as a language or a sign, but as a dead thing. Why is that important? Why does he bring up this comparison? Not as a language. Well, at least a language has some sort of, it may be arbitrary, but there's some sort of signification there. Remember back several paragraphs ago when we talked about the skull ultimately signifies nothing? The only way you can make it signify is when you put it next to other skulls and you import some meaning into it. It's not a sign. It's a dead thing. It's not even an organ. He says what was ruled out by the very first observation of inorganic nature, so this is the sign, this is where things are screwed up. What was ruled out from the very first observation of inorganic nature, the idea that the notion ought to be present in the form of a thing, is here being asserted as the latest in development, the fundamental achievement of observation or observing reason. He says that what it does is this turns the reality of spirit into a thing, or expressing it the other way around, gives to lifeless being the significance of spirit. We saw that happen when talking about, well, these bumps should signify, they should have the significance of things that are actually spiritual or mental, things that are distinctively human. So he goes on and he says, observation has reached a point where it's declaring what our notion of it was, that the certainty of reason seeks its own self as an objective reality. Hegel is endorsing this. Reason is seeking its own self as an objective reality. It's going to continue to do so in the paragraphs yet to come in this section, and in the section that follows, and the section that follows, right? What it's doing here, where it's making a mistake, is saying, well, because it's doing that, therefore spirit can be understood as a being, or it's going to amount to the same thing as a thing. So he says, the intention, here's where the sophistication comes in. The intention is not to state that spirit, which is represented by a skull, is a thing. There's not meant to be any materialism at all, as it's called in this idea. Rather, spirit must be something more and other than these bones. But then you can say, well, what is it besides these bones? And here's where the problem comes in. Spirit is still being treated as just an extra being on top of that being. This is why people who are struggling with, trying to make sense out of how do you get consciousness out of material things are still struggling with this problem today, because they're looking for something that would be an extra of the same kind of being. Hegel talks about this right here. He says, to say that spirit merely is means nothing else than it's a thing. When being as such or thinghood is predicated of spirit, the true expression of this is what? That spirit is the same kind of being that a bone is. So if you don't want to say spirit is a bone, but you want to say that the bone somehow expresses spirit, then you wind up saying that spirit is something like a bone, a pseudo-bone, an uber bone, or whatever kind of bone you want, right? But it's not spirit. You've lost sight of what spirit is in the process. And this is a fundamental problem here that he's expressing. So he says, it must therefore be regarded as extremely important that the true expression has been found for the bare statement about spirit. That it is. Right? Spirit is. Spirit is what? Spirit is a being. Spirit is something in itself. Spirit is something that observing reason can look around and find, and then be done with. If it does that, it's not really grasping spirit, because spirit is something more, and not just more in the sense of adding more stuff on, just a, bad infinity, but rather transcending it. So he says, when in other respects it's said of spirit that it has being as a thing, a single separate reality, this is not intended to mean it's something we can see or take in our hands or touch, but that is what is said. Hegel is telling us here, you may disavow any sort of materialism or reductionism in taking this sort of stance, but that doesn't evade reductionism. You are still reducing spirit to something that is less than it, and that's a fundamental problem. So is there any way in which we can address this problem? It's not going to be by simply reinstating this point of view. He says, what is really said is expressed by saying that the being of spirit is a bone, the being of spirit. Now, you could say there's a way out of this for the person who's caught in this trap. Maybe they can say that the spirituality of spirit is something different than the bone, or different than the extra that we're putting in there. But That's not what the person is saying that Hegel is taking as the interlocutor. And even if they did say it, so what? Then they still have to explain what that extra is, don't they? And that's just not being provided here. So here we're seeing how phrenology is winding up in a fundamental problematic that it can't get out of. Now this result has a twofold significance. One is its true meaning, insofar as it is a completion of the outcome of the preceding movement of self-consciousness. The unhappy self-consciousness renounced its independence and struggled to make its being for self into a thing. It thereby reverted from self-consciousness to consciousness, that is, to the consciousness for which the object is something which merely is, a thing. But here, what is a thing is self-consciousness. The thing is, therefore, the unity of the I and being, the category. The object being determined thus for consciousness, the latter possesses reason. Consciousness, as well as self-consciousness, is in itself reason, but only that consciousness for which the object is determined as the category can be said to have reason. From this, however, we must still distinguish the knowledge of what reason is. The category, which is the immediate unity of being and self, must pass through both forms, and it is precisely for consciousness, qua observer, that the category presents itself in the form of being. This consciousness, in its result, enunciates as a proposition that of which it is the unconscious certainty, the proposition that is implicit in the notion of reason. This proposition is the infinite judgment that the self is a thing, a judgment that suspends itself. Through this result, then, the category is further determined as being this self-superseding antithesis. The pure category which is present for consciousness in the form of being or immediacy is the object as still unmediated, as merely given, and consciousness is equally unmediated in its relation to it. The moment of that infinite judgment is the transition of immediacy into mediation or negativity. The given object is consequently determined as a negative object. Consciousness, however, is determined as a self-consciousness over against it. In other words, the category which, in the course of observation, has run through the form of being is now posited in the form of being for self. Consciousness no longer aims to find itself immediately, but to produce itself by its own activity. It is itself the end at which its action aims, whereas in its role of observer, it was concerned only with things. Paragraph 344 is, let's say, from the very start, a bit obscure. And I think that it's going to benefit from some commentary and from charting things out on the chalkboard a bit. I want to say, to begin with, that there aren't any paragraphs in Hegel that I think are easy to read and immediately grasp what he's saying just on the first reading. They often require a lot of going back over and thinking about what he's doing, and that's good. That's the way it ought to be if what he's doing here is indeed a phenomenology of spirit. But there are times where you're probably left wondering, should I skip this paragraph or can I figure out what he's talking about? And so hopefully this will help out a bit. He starts out by talking about the unhappy consciousness. And he talks about it as the unhappy self-consciousness, which is correct because it's part of the self-consciousness section, right? And he says that this is the result of things. The phrenology is culminated in this. So he says, this is the true meaning insofar as it's a completion of the outcome of the preceding movement of self-consciousness. Unhappy self-consciousness renounced its independence. It struggled to make its being for self into a thing. So that was sort of what was going on in these last several paragraphs that we've been looking at. You know, if spirit is a bone, then spirit is being turned into a thing. And so that is similar to what was going on with the unhappy consciousness. In that case, it was, projecting the other out into the void and finding it there as God or something, divine like that. So he says that it reverted in doing so, this is a very important point, from self-consciousness to consciousness, to the consciousness for which the object is something which merely is a thing. Now notice what happened in the process. So it projects self-consciousness, agency, out there to the divine, to the eternal, and in the process transforms itself into just consciousness. It's just there to behold or to act in relation to that. But what ends up happening in the process is self-consciousness gets turned into a thing, and that's why it's the unhappy consciousness, because it doesn't have a reconciliation with itself. By engaging in this gambit of projecting its essence outward, it doesn't win it back. That's a big problem. So Hegel goes on and he says, it reverted to a consciousness for which the object is something which merely is a thing. But here, what is a thing is self-consciousness, right? The thing is self-consciousness. Why does he say that? Because observing reason, at the point that we've arrived at, the whole point of doing the physiognomy and the phrenology, and even the portion before it about logical and psychological laws, the whole point of that was to make sense out of self-consciousness. Reason wanted to know what the hell is going on with human beings. How do they work? How do they tick? And it treated them as things over and over again. So he goes on and he says, the thing is self-consciousness. Therefore, the thing is, therefore, what does it mean to be self-consciousness? The unity of I and being. Which is what? Here Hegel uses this term category. So we have over here the ich, right? Why is Hegel talking about category here? Well, he's talked about category already in a fairly non-standard way earlier on in this section in talking about the individual making sense of him or herself, and also in terms of agency, right? But here, what we're looking at is something that's supposed to be a unity of being and self. And what is a category supposed to allow us? It allows a kind of connection, a universality between the perceiver and that which is perceived, or that which is acting upon and willing and choosing, and that which is acted upon or willed or chosen. We can go on and on with this, right? So don't read too many Kantian overtones into this at this point. Hegel is going to go on, and he says, now he's going to explore this notion of the category. He says, the object being determined, thus for consciousness, the latter, consciousness, possesses reason. Okay, so all of this possesses reason, right? He says consciousness as well as self-consciousness is in itself reason. Reason is the higher stage that we've talked about so far. But only that consciousness for which the object is determined as the category can be said to have reason. To have it in a sort of conscious way. To be reasoning about its own reasoning. To be reasoning about what it itself is. To be asking these fundamental questions of how do I work? To have that reflexivity that rational being makes possible. So he goes on and he says, from this, however, we must still distinguish the knowledge of what reason is. So the category, which is, again, this immediate unity of being and self, must pass, as he says, through both forms. What does that mean? So the category has to be essentially divided into the two forms, I and being. And when we consider the side of being, the category is present as a being. So he says, here we go. It's precisely for consciousness qua observer, the category presents itself in the form of being. How do we have being? We don't have being without consciousness. Not consciousness in the being, but consciousness of the being. So we still have a category that is a unity between I and being, but now on this side as the being. So he says the consciousness in its result announces as a proposition that of which it is the unconscious certainty. It actually knows this at bottom. The proposition that's implicit in the notion of reason. This proposition is the infinite judgment that the self is a thing. Now notice what he's going to say right after that. A judgment that suspends itself. To say that something is infinite doesn't always mean that it's good. Right? There's a bad infinity of just oscillating back and forth or just heaping up extra stuff over and over again without adding significance. So he says, through this result, the category is further determined as being this self-superseding antithesis. The pure category, which is present in the form of being or immediacy, is the object still unmediated. The self, being treated as a being, is not really grasped as the self, you might say. It's treated as merely given, and consciousness is equally unmediated in its relation to it. So then he says the moment of infinite judgment is the transition of immediacy into mediation or negativity. Now, where are we going to get that? Well, we have to swing over now to the other side. Where we find negativity, where we find negation going on, is in being for self. This sounds rather Sartrean at this stage, I suppose, to some people who are used to putting things in those terms, but this is where Sartre got this sort of stuff from, right? So he goes on, and he says, here we go. The moment of that infinite judgment, the given object is consequently determined as a negative object. Consciousness is determined as self-consciousness over against it. In other words, he says, the category which in the course of observation has run through the form of being is now posited in the form of being for self. Now, here he's going to finally get to the real meat, the point of all this. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because he's going to finish by talking about something being its own point or end or purpose. It is itself the end at which its action aims, whereas in its role of observer it was concerned only with things, right? We're seeing an enactment of exactly what Hegel's talking about here. What is all this about? What is all this going towards? This sentence here. Consciousness no longer aims to find itself immediately. It's no longer, as it's trying to make sense of itself, trying to grasp itself just in terms of being, like a skull or its organs. It's got to be more than that. What's that more? Some sort of vague spirituality, a ghost in the machine? No. What is it? Activity, action, practice, doing. That is what consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, is trying to grasp itself as. He says it no longer tries to find itself immediately, but to produce itself by its own activity. To produce itself. Its action is no longer just an action against other things or transforming other things. It is now explicitly engaged in transforming or producing or finding or doing, whatever we want to say here, itself. So observing reason, having gone through all of this, having gone through this entire process of trying to, figure out things about the bumps on the head and looking at the frame, all those sorts of things were leading up to this point where it can finally put that aside and say, that's interesting, but it doesn't really work. What does work is figuring out what I am by looking at what I do how I do it, why I do it. And so Hegel finishes here by saying it is itself the end at which its action aims. Its action is not just to do things, it's also to understand itself. Whereas in its role as observer it was concerned only with things, now it can finally start to grasp itself as spirit. This is leading up to a transformation in the notion of reason.